one of the things that we should be focusing on is we are to comply with the federal ID program. And I don't think anyone has really gotten into the full discussion of what we're going to comply with. We talk about airline opportunities, but we don't talk about the compliance issue. And the compliance issue that is most troubling, at least to me, and I think Carlos Mariani, the other chief author back when we prohibited Real ID, joining 32 other states in saying no to the federal government, was that in the Real ID provision, the federal law, Congress has given the authority to Department of Homeland Security to expand the function of Real ID whenever they would deem appropriate. That means representational government is out of the equation when it comes to writing an expanded version of Real ID. That's what the federal government wants us to comply with. So I just wanted to add that early in this discussion because that's at least troubling to me, to give the authority of representational government to a political appointee. That can be this administration, it could have been the last administration, and it certainly will be the future administration of who that person may be. And they may not have the same perspective on representational government as I think I do. And so I hope you would at least have that concern in the back of your mind as we have this public discussion. Thank you.
I have a son that's involved in industry that does collect a lot of data. And what he said is that there's everything that you can possibly think of can today be digitized. Your fingerprints can be digitized. Your iPhone has it. Your voice can be digitized, for voice printing. Your retina scans. There's lots of, in fact, I guess, the old one is your face. Your face, there's facial recognition programs that you can purchase if you run a casino. So this is old technology, and all of that can be digitized. And what happens with all of these databases is they may be separately stored, but one database talks to another database by using something called a foreign access code. And I don't know that there's anybody that I've talked to here that knows how all of those things work and what is the good things that can happen, which I'm sure there are a lot of good things that can happen, but what are the threats that we might face? If you go across the border, for instance, I think if you go across the border into Wisconsin, they have access to our driver's records. And when they scan, you can be prevented from driving in Canada if you had a DUI in Minnesota, for instance. And I think that's an important thing that all citizens need to know, is that there is a lot of information that's already kept. And is this Real ID a matter of co-locating all of that information or making it accessible from one point when you present that Real ID? And I believe, Senator Limmer and I worked together on this back in 2008, and one of the things that we were objecting to was, of course, the financial cost, but also it was going to be connected with Interpol. It was going to be connected with, of course, the U.S. FBI and all kinds of other databases. But, is this around the world? Because we already have passports that are connected to databases around the world. But is this going to be even more, let's say, more intrusive? Will it be more serious than what we've ever encountered before?
Our biggest fear is that if we start to approach 2020 and that implementation deadline by the federal government, if we have millions of Minnesotans trying to get into 141 locations across the state, we are going to have a real challenge on our hands. I will always speak very highly of the dedicated work that state employees do, but that is a very big fear that we have, that we are going to have that kind of a need and a demand on our system at that point. So whatever we can do to give us as much of an implementation timetable as possible, that would be helpful to us.
You can go to specific locations and get a Real ID compliant license right now. And I think I get a little bit concerned about hearing from the administration that we're going to have a stampede. I think we haven't even talked about, are we going to have everyone get a real ID, compliant ID, even when they renew? Or are we going to have the ability to have a real ID or not have a real ID? Because there are a lot of Minnesotans that won't ever need necessarily a real ID. Prime example I have is my mother-in-law is in a nursing home. She's a quadriplegic. She's never going to be flying ever again. She doesn't certainly need a real ID, and she wouldn't want to pay the associated costs that will go into a real ID, because I think, as the administration has said here, I think we're going to have some significant cost increases. So I think in regards to the comments just previously heard, I think we're putting the cart before the horse just a little bit to determine how much, what are we going to need, how much money are we going to need, are we going to be charging everybody the same charge, as opposed to if you need a real ID, you have to pay an upcharge for that additional benefit on the card, as opposed to residents of Minnesota who, from my perspective, I've got my passport, I've got a federal compliant ID right now, I'll never need a real ID, and why should I pay for it? So there's a lot of policy implications we haven't even gotten into yet. So I think the committee needs to be careful how many steps we take forward before we start into the legislative session, before we start saying this is what we're going to do, much less the administration starting to plan for 1.6 million people starting to stampede to fill their IDs out or change their IDs.
I think it's essential that we do not follow a federal guideline here in one size fits all. We have many options in front of us, and I think it's critical that we allow discussions on those options, and then, to Representative Creshaw's point, provide education and information to our constituents so they can make the best choices. In other words, some constituents might choose their driver's license solely for driving, and they might choose a passport card or a passport for traveling. But let's be very careful that we don't step in as the Minnesota legislature and tell every citizen how they have to comply with real ID when the needs are so different.